Some folks are on silver spoon in hand. Y'all don't to help themselves, y'all. But when the tax man comes to the door, y'all, the house looking like a rummage sale, yes. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no millionaire son, no, no. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one, no. You down to war. And when you ask them how much should we give, who's the only answer for? It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no military son. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate son.
Welcome. Here we are. A little Vietnam War music and some video there to get you in the mood for today's Vietnam War presentation. So this is going to be a sort of like the slide presentations that I do in class. Obviously it won't be quite the same. You won't be able to answer my questions, but I am going to have the pictures are mostly similar. It won't be exactly the same, but they're mostly similar. I'm going to go over the pictures. I'll talk about it. You've got your outline in front of you. If you don't have your outline in front of you, make sure you have your outline in front of you. You can see the pictures on the screen. You've got a little bit of me even as you can take some of those notes as you go. So anyways, we're just going to go ahead and go here. It'll be a little bit different. Like I said, I may screw up a little bit. I'm not going to restart the whole video because it's going to be a long one. This is something, just so you know, that this would have been over, probably 2 to 3 days. So even though it's going to be a long video, don't feel like you have to sit through the whole thing at once. I'm going to try to break it up. A few more songs there. Vietnam has essentially a great soundtrack because there was some great music being made and a lot of music that dealt with Vietnam. And so I'll have some other songs to break it up if you need a little break and hopefully enjoy some of that. I know some of you enjoy some of that music too. So we'll do a little bit of that. But again, don't feel like you got to go through the whole thing. And if you feel like, I'm not getting it as you go, you can just stop and rewind it and you can re-listen. So again, don't feel like you got to listen to it all at once. There will be a quiz on Friday, but nothing that you have to get done, immediately all at once. Break it up a little bit. That's totally fine. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So here we go. We should be on your outlines. It should be on the French in Vietnam. So here we are, the French in Vietnam. So the French here were in control, before we get to opposition of French rule here, the French were in control of this entire area that you see here on the map. What was North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Southeast Asia was called French Indochina. They were in control of that before World War II. You can see here in the years they were colonized as far back as 1863. So these were essentially French colonies that they had. So what happened was that during World War II, the Japanese largely took over most of this area. And then eventually after World War II, the French came back in and at the end of 1945 to try to reestablish their dominance. However, there had been a group created during the war that was essentially a Vietnamese independence group called the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh were led by Ho Chi Minh, and which is what was the name. Viet Minh was named after him. Ho Chi Minh was their leader. And this was not only a Vietnamese independence group, but a communist group, a group that was looking to basically get out any foreign invaders and create a communist Vietnam. And so what happened was that this group, when the French came back in after World War II to sort of reassert their dominance in Vietnam, the Viet Minh opposed this, as you might guess. Ho Chi Minh opposed this. And in 1946, there was, fighting broke out. They started to militarily opposed French rule and tried to start to get rid of the French through fighting, that they were not going to just let the French basically control their country. Now, what they did was the appeal for Ho Chi Minh wasn't so much the communist part of it. He realized that maybe not everybody would like the idea of being communist. So what his appeal was that he was really pushing the independence. That basically for all of history, Vietnam had been controlled by somebody, whether it was China or France or Japan. And his goal was to, hey, let's let Vietnamese people control Vietnam finally. And so, again, he didn't push this as a communist revolution, but just as an independence revolution, a patriotic revolution. And so that's how it sort of started. So the U.S. here has got to choose a side. This is post-World War II, and the United States has emerged, of course, after the World War II, along with the Soviet Union, as one of the two major world powers. And particularly because the United States is a little bit worried about the spread of communism. This is important. Now, actually, Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh leader, believed that the United States would come in on his side. Because after World War II, President Harry Truman had publicly denounced colonialism, basically larger countries taking over smaller countries. He said this is part of the reason World War II happened. This is part of the reason people get upset and part of the reason wars happen. So bigger countries should not be controlling smaller countries. Colonialism should be put in an end. And so Ho Chi Minh thought that, well, maybe the United States will actually come to our aid here since they're going against colonialism. However, the reality was that it was more important to Truman to contain the spread of communism. If you recall back a while ago, we talked about the policy of containment that went along with the Truman Doctrine, which is to stop the spread of communism. And obviously, as we saw in Korea, that was not only going to be in Europe, but also in Asia. And so in 1946, we had to decide what to do. And not only did we want to stop communism, but you have to remember that we also had a long-standing alliance with the French, going all the way back to the American Revolution, in which, without French assistance in the American Revolution, we would never have defeated the British and gotten our independence. So we have a really long relationship with the French. We assisted them during World War I and World War II. And now, obviously, we're not going to go against the French and support a communist takeover of Vietnam. And so we lend our support to the French. And so what is our support? What kind of support do we choose here as we choose a side? It's mostly financial at this point. Lots of money. We pour in all kinds of money to the French to help them fight their war against the Vietnamese, to help keep them from being communist. Again, the major goal here is to stop the spread of communism. However, while most people would have thought the French were going to win, it does not go very well for the French. The Vietnamese turn out to be a very, very difficult foe here. And so by 1954, after 8 years of fighting, the French are finally defeated. At the final battle is this battle of Dien Bien Phu, in which you can see here Dien Bien Phu up here in the northern regions, where the French are essentially massacred in this battle. They are caught in kind of a valley, a low area, and the Vietnamese just pour in on the Viet Minh from both sides, and they kill almost everyone. It is sort of lore that the commander of the Vietnamese commander is asked. It's clearly they're winning the battle, and he is asked, what should we do? People are surrendering, and he, whether he actually says this or not, but the lore is that he says, when he's asked what should we do with the prisoners, he says, kill them all. If we kill them all, maybe they'll stop coming. And so it is an absolute massacre here. And the French leave. And so what happens when the French leave, and this is important, I know there isn't really a spot on this, but make sure you put something off to the side here, is that when the French leave, the country is divided. And you can see it here. That green line is basically the dividing line, which is roughly the 17th parallel. Let's see some similarities again to Korea. And North Vietnam is set up as a communist government, and South Vietnam is set up as a non-communist government, with the idea being that there's going to be elections within a couple of years. There's going to be this thing called the Geneva Convention, in which there will be elections. Now, this never actually happens because the South, there were supposed to be elections 2 years later. The South says essentially that they don't trust the North, and that they don't believe that there'll be fair elections. And so the elections to reunite the country never happen. And so this is where you start to get the seeds of the problem of the United States maybe getting themselves involved here as well. Okay, so that ends our first one. Here you see our second picture. This is a picture of the domino theory. Here you see Laos, Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, Japan, others here, and with the United States there at the end. And so I'll talk a little bit here about this domino theory. So the domino theory was came up was. I don't know, invented is the right word, but was created by President Dwight Eisenhower. And his idea here was that if you let one of these Southeast Asian countries fall, then the others will also fall to, what I mean by fall is fall to communism, and then the dominoes will fall. And he basically said it's like a row of dominoes. When you push the first one over, the others will all topple. And essentially the rest of the world will eventually fall. You see Canada and the United States there at the end. And so there was this belief, and a lot of people bought into this, that if we allow these dominoes to start falling, then the rest of the world will become communist. So you can get the idea here of what sort of pushes us to this involvement. It goes back, starts with Truman right after World War II and this idea of containment. We have to stop the spread of communism. It continues with the next president, Dwight Eisenhower, who says that this domino theory, that we must stop this, that if we allow one to fall, that others will fall, and communism will keep spreading all over the world if we continue to let these dominoes fall. And so these ideas sort of drive U.S. foreign policy in Vietnam, this belief that we have to stop the spread, we have to stop the dominoes from falling. And so you can see even earlier presidents, before ever even fighting in Vietnam, Presidents Truman and Presidents Eisenhower will have an impact on future policy here. President Eisenhower himself continues to send money to Vietnam, and he also sends a handful of military advisors. Somewhere in the neighborhood between 600 and 1,000 U.S. military advisors go to South Vietnam to try to aid the South Vietnamese. By this time, there is some fighting between the North and the South, and they are there to try to aid the South Vietnamese, train the South Vietnamese. We're not actually in combat, but we're there to try to help in whatever fashion we can to get the South Vietnamese to be able to defend themselves from the North taking over, to keep communism from spreading, to keep that domino from falling. So that is the domino theory. Eisenhower, obviously, he serves his 2 terms. And in 1960, President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, comes into office. And so he has to decide what he is going to do with Vietnam. Just as his predecessors, Truman and Eisenhower, JFK must now make a decision on what to do with Vietnam. And so JFK decides that he also is going to try to stop communism from spreading. You have to remember at this time, too, that for really any politician to appear weak on communism is basically political suicide. And so whether they felt that it was truly worth it or not didn't always necessarily mean as much as the fact that you had to appear tough on communism. Otherwise, your political career could be ruined. And so Kennedy decides, yes, we must also push forward. We must also support the Vietnamese. We continue to send all kinds of money, but he also steps up the aid to Vietnam, and we're up to now by 1963, when Kennedy is assassinated, we're up to 16,000 military advisors in Vietnam who are doing everything. They are training, they are helping devise battle strategy, all of that kind of thing. There is even some of these military advisors who get caught sometimes in fights. They're not there to fight specifically, but sometimes they're out in the field, they're helping with battle strategy, they're helping train the troops, they're helping do whatever, and they run into the enemy. And so some Americans are even fighting at this point in Vietnam a little bit as well. And that will lead us to our next slide here. So you can see here a couple of pictures. The one on the left, these are some of the first troops arriving in Vietnam. First American combat troops, arriving in Vietnam. And you see some other pictures here, some soldiers in the field and all the helicopters. You notice maybe the helicopters in that video too with the first song. Before I get into this next slide, I do want to just talk for a second about helicopters. Helicopters played a huge role in Vietnam, because with the jungle terrain, you could basically, helicopters can almost come straight in and straight out. So they just needed a small clearing to be able to drop troops off, pick troops up, get wounded troops, you name it. Helicopters were used to a huge effect in Vietnam. So you see a lot of them in videos and pictures, and that's why, because there was a ton of helicopter use in Vietnam. All right, so let's go on to our next one here, and that is that Johnson escalates the war. So Johnson's Vietnam dilemma here. So as Johnson becomes president, remember LBJ becomes president, of course, when Kennedy is assassinated. And so Lyndon Johnson has to decide what to do. It's now up to him. His predecessors, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy have all supported South Vietnam, or supported first the French and then now South Vietnam, trying to stop that spread of communism. Now, Lyndon Johnson has, like I said, he's got this dilemma as he comes into office. He is told that basically if we don't step up our involvement, that South Vietnam will surely fail. And so this is a quote from Lyndon Johnson, from LBJ, about what he thought about Vietnam. He said, Vietnam is the biggest damn mess I ever saw. I don't think it's worth fighting for, but I don't think we can get out. Basically, he had thought that at this point we were so far involved that we had to follow it through. On top of that, he did believe, just like everybody else, that the communist threat was real and that it could spread all over the country. And so absolutely, he decided that it's time to get involved as well. So with all this pressure, Johnson was sort of looking for reasons to get us more involved. He believed that there had to be more of a combat presence, American combat presence in Vietnam if we were likely to be successful there. And so he gets something happens in 1964 that's known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So what the Gulf of Tonkin incident is essentially there are American battleships in the Gulf of Tonkin. If you go back a couple here, you can see the Gulf of Tonkin right up here in North Vietnam. And these American battleships are stationed there essentially as a presence to warn the North Vietnamese, things like that. But what ends up happening is, supposedly, and again, this is supposedly because there is some debate on whether or not this actually takes place, but supposedly a couple of small gunboats, North Vietnamese gunboats, attacked the American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The reality is that, again, a lot of people doubted this ever even took place. There is some people who doubt that it ever actually even happened. But there is, if it did happen, essentially these two gunboats were, no more annoying than a fly. If you're sitting on your couch at home and a fly is bothering you, it's sort of annoying, but it's not a real threat. And but what this did for LBJ was it allowed him to have an excuse to basically get more involved. And so he basically blows up this Gulf of Tonkin incident as an unprovoked attack in international waters and as a reason for him to push for more action. And so he goes to Congress and he gets them to propose a Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And this is the important part. Make sure you get this down under the Gulf of Tonkin incident here, because it leads to this, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is that basically it gives President Johnson the ability to do whatever he wants in Vietnam without a declaration of war from Congress. There is never a declaration of war from Congress for the Vietnam War. And it's because of this. He gets this. Now, he asked Congress for this. And later on, of course, there will be all kinds of people that will be some politicians, lots of protesting and things, which we'll talk about later. And people will blame a lot of this on LBJ. And his presidency really is smeared by Vietnam, his legacy. But the reality is that Congress willingly gave him this. It was unanimous in the House. I think I don't know how many were in the House in those days, over 400-0 in the House to give him these powers. And in the Senate, only 2 senators, 88-2 in the Senate, voted in favor of giving him these powers. So Congress willingly gave him the powers in this Gulf of Tonkin resolution to essentially do whatever he felt was necessary in Vietnam. And that's what he did. And so he escalates the war. By early 1965, we are doing regular bombing runs over North Vietnam basically on a daily basis. And by the end of 1965, we have nearly 200,000 combat troops in Vietnam. We are now way past military advisors. These are ground troops, like you see here in the picture and in this picture, combat troops on the ground in Vietnam fighting in combat. Excuse me. By 1966, we're up to we have another 200,000 troops. And by 1967, the height of the war, the height of our involvement in Vietnam, there are 500,000 American combat troops in Vietnam. So LBJ certainly deserves a lot of what will essentially be blamed for Vietnam. He is absolutely the one that sent in the combat troops that escalated the war way beyond money and advisors, no doubt about it. But he did have, he wasn't the initial one to get us involved, and there certainly were some external pressures on him to be involved. So anyhow, that's where we are now. Let's head to the next one now that we're fighting. So we have a picture here of a Vietnamese booby trap, which I will get to in a minute. So I want to talk a little bit here about quite a bit here about the difficulties of fighting in Vietnam. You see a lot of letters there on your paper. So make sure you get these down as we go here. I'll go through all of them as we go. You'll get most of them. If you get up with most, then you'll be good. If you don't end up getting all the way to I think it'll be okay. So anyhow, on paper, when we start this out on paper, most everybody in the world, right, would think that the United States is going to win this war easily. We are in 1965. Probably the most powerful or the second most powerful military in the world. We are one of the great victors of World War I, of World War II. We are the richest country in the world. We have this massive production capability. Our population is bigger than the Vietnamese. It looks like this should be a walk in the park, right? That shouldn't be any problem whatsoever. But we all know, of course, that it doesn't go very well for us. So why is that? What were some of these difficulties in Vietnam? Well, the number one, the very first, not the number one, but just these are in no order. But one of the first difficulties of fighting in Vietnam was the terrain. It's all jungle, and there isn't really jungle in the United States. And so while this is all new to us, and the jungle, what I mean by the jungle is not just there's thick foliage and it's hot and it's muggy. There's also a monsoon season where it rains for like months at a time, and so you have all kinds of issues that you're dealing with here with the terrain and the jungle, and we're not used to it, but they are used to it. So anyway, so they're used to this, so they have a major home field advantage here. While they're used to it, we are not. They know the ins and outs of the country, and we're there and essentially uncomfortable. So that's one of the difficulties for the Americans of fighting in Vietnam. A second difficulty of fighting in Vietnam was that the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. I guess I'm going to start here with this one. It was difficult to tell friend from foe. Because here we were fighting for the South, right? But there was this group, and this kind of goes together with this, and make sure, and I would write maybe this off to the side, the Viet Cong, this group of people called the Viet Cong, and I'll refer to them as the VC. So when we're talking about the VC, I'm always talking about the Viet Cong, Vietcong. It's two words, Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were South Vietnamese who were essentially fighting on the side of the North. Now, they were like a separate fighting force. You had the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and then you had the Viet Cong. They had separate leadership, but they did work together. They were essentially like allies. The North Vietnamese didn't necessarily command the Viet Cong, but they were essentially allies here. So the Viet Cong were like this guerrilla force in the South. They were South Vietnamese, but they were essentially fighting on the same side as the North. Now, that makes things very difficult because here you are, an American soldier, and you're supposed to be fighting to try to help the South Vietnamese, and yet here are these people, the VC, the Viet Cong, who are fighting against you. So it's really difficult. And you didn't know when you went to the villages. If you're an American soldier, you're going around to the villages. You did not know if these people were on your side or not. If they were hiding VC, if they were counting government soldiers as they went by. If there was if the woman on the side of the road who was peddling this or that, if she was on your side or against you, you never knew. Quote on that here concerning that topic. So this is from an American soldier. He said, "You never knew who the enemy was and who was the friend. Here's a woman of 22 or 23. She is pregnant, and she tells an interrogator that her husband works in Da Nang and isn't Viet Cong. But she watches your men walk down a trail and get killed or wounded in a booby trap. She knows the booby trap is there, but she doesn't warn them. The enemy was all around you." So, I mean, that was this big problem. I mean, you never knew who friend and foe was, and it led to some pretty bad situations where civilians were killed, villages were burned, sometimes retaliation, sometimes because there was a belief that they were harboring VC, you name it. So the Viet Cong and this not understanding friend or foe not being able to just know who friend or foe was one of the major difficulties of fighting in Vietnam. The next one was that the soldiers in Vietnam, the NVA, both the NVA and the VC, one of their tactics was to fight as close as possible. They were told to fight belt buckle to belt buckle. Now, that wasn't literally usually. I mean, you didn't literally get that close. But the reason that this made things difficult for the United States was that when they fought that type, we had major advantages in air power and artillery, the heavy cannon, the air power. We basically controlled all of that. They had very, very little in the way of heavy artillery or air power. And so we could have these massive bombing attacks, artillery attacks. But what happened was when they would fight close by, it was very difficult to use these things because if you did that, we're fighting close quarters, it's very easy to hit your own troops, friendly fire as they call it, and wound and kill your own men with your own fire. So what they would do is they would fight in close combat to try to negate our advantages in air and artillery power. Now, I'm not saying we didn't use air and artillery in Vietnam, because we did a ton, but this was one of the things they did to try to negate that advantage during battles. Fight belt buckle to belt buckle, so that if we did have to bring it in, or if we did bring it in, not only would we kill North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, but we would also kill American troops at the same time. And so this was another of the difficulties of fighting. Make sure when I give you these that you don't just write down, friend or foe or belt buckle to belt buckle fighting. You have to give the why, explain why this was difficult. So make sure you get the why part of it as well. Moving on, the next thing that made things difficult to fight in Vietnam for American troops was that they had the North Vietnamese, and particularly the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. There was this elaborate tunnel system all throughout Vietnam underneath the jungle. And so what this allowed them to do was allow them to have basically hit and run, where they would hit you quick and then they would slip away. Basically, a lot of times, American soldiers could be out on patrol somewhere in the jungle, and then seemingly out of nowhere, there would be soldiers all over them, enemy soldiers all over them. And there would be this brief and very intense firefight, and then all of a sudden, boom, they would slip away and they would be gone. And they would go into these tunnels. And the tunnels were extremely complex. They had, the tunnels not only had, dugout areas for them to escape to, but there were like field hospitals under there. There was electricity oftentimes. The entrances were usually hidden, sometimes in village huts. Sometimes they were like in the sides of trees. Sometimes they were even, you'd have to enter from like, you have to swim underwater in a river, under the riverbank to get to the tunnel entrance. There were all kinds of traps down there. And there was also, Americans sometimes went into these tunnels. The guys that did this were known as tunnel rats. It was not something that you had to be really brave. It was not something most guys wanted to do. But you get down there, and the tunnels weren't like you got down and it was just a straight shot. There was almost always a turn, and a turn right away, so you couldn't just drop down and shoot straight down an alley at people if you were chasing somebody. And then there was almost always immediately like a choice. And oftentimes, one of those choices was booby-trapped, and the other one was to wherever. Now, obviously, the Vietnamese would know where to go, but the American troops would not know. So it was really dangerous once you got down there. Not only was that a danger, but there were also these tunnels lent themselves to deadly animals. Particularly snakes would be down there. And there were lots of poisonous snakes in Vietnam. The one that the soldiers were scared of the most was called a three-step snake. That's not the official name for it, of course, but they called it the three-step snake because it was so venomous that if it bit you, you were dead by the third step. And snakes liked that kind of dark, cool area down there. It was a little moist down there below ground. So it was a little scary to be down there, to say the least. So this tunnel system that they could slip away into allowed them to do practice guerrilla warfare, etc. That leads me to my next one. The difficulty is that hit and run warfare, the guerrilla warfare, particularly the Viet Cong, but even the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, rarely engaged in large scale like World War II style or even Korean War style battles where you had these large militaries on both sides kind of slugging it out. They didn't do that because they realized pretty quickly that the United States had such superior firepower that these large scale battles were not in their favor. And so they would do these quick hit and run type fights where, like I said, they would hit quick and then melt away into the jungle somewhere, whether it was into the tunnels or just off into the jungle and away. They would not fight long, protracted battles oftentimes because we had such an advantage in firepower that they realized that this was not the way to win, but these short, quick, harassing fights and generally then slip away before we could really get the artillery and air fire in on them. So that was frustrating to the United States. It was hard to get these big decisive wins, these decisive victories like we'd had in previous wars, in which you win this battle, you move to here, you move to the next place. So those were really elusive in Vietnam. So that was part of what made it difficult as well. Another thing that made it difficult to fight in Vietnam was this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was trails that led all through Vietnam and through the jungle. But not only that, but they also went into Cambodia and Laos. And so why did the Ho Chi Minh Trail give us difficulties? There's two things that made the Ho Chi Minh Trail difficult, so you can kind of put this as an A and a B. Number one, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was difficult because they could travel basically along the Ho Chi Minh Trail even in the middle of the day and move supplies and troops and whatever else they needed. And there was not much we could do about it because we couldn't see them. The jungle canopy, it was so thick that it was very difficult to see them, to bomb their movements. So, for instance, like in World War II, towards the end, we had such control of the air that the Germans, basically couldn't, lift an eyelid during the day without us just bombing the heck out of their position. In Vietnam, the NVA and the VC had basically freedom of movement because through the jungle, it was almost impossible to see them unless you spotted them from the ground and called in the air fire, the artillery or air fire from there. There's nothing you could do about it. So it allowed them freedom of movement on the trail against supplies and such. The other thing was that it went into Cambodia and Laos. And so we were not allowed, by our rules of engagement, the U.S. military was not allowed to go into Cambodia and Laos. So the troops, particularly VC, could slip into Cambodia and Laos at any time they wanted to, and we couldn't go after them. And they knew that. They knew we couldn't go after them. So this made it really hard for us because there might have just been a fierce fight right near the border, but if they crossed the border, we're not allowed to go over there. Not only could the troops go over there, but they kept a lot of their supplies there. Huge dumps of military goods, weapons dumps and things like that. And so there was no way for us to wipe out their weapons dumps even. Couldn't bomb them, couldn't go after them because we were not allowed to go into Cambodia and Laos. So this Ho Chi Minh Trail, for those two reasons, the dense canopy that allowed freedom of movement, plus the fact that they could escape and store things in Cambodia and Laos, really posed a major difficulty for U.S. troops in Vietnam. The next difficulty of fighting in Vietnam is the booby traps. There were all kinds of booby traps in Vietnam. They were everywhere. You never knew if your next step would be your last. The reality of fighting in Vietnam was that you could be out on patrol for weeks and never see an enemy soldier. In fact, you rarely did see enemy soldiers. It's not like in the movies where they're just constantly encountering the enemy. It was oftentimes you rarely saw the enemy. But meanwhile, you could die or be wounded, seriously wounded throughout all this. Some of the booby traps that they like to use were these things right here on your screen. This is called a punji pit. And what the punji pits were is it's this dugout pit, and it would have been covered with some kind of ground covering so you wouldn't know it was there. And then you have these punji stakes, and you can see them here in the picture, these super sharpened wooden stakes. And essentially you would fall in the pit and you would be gored by these stakes. That was the idea. They often poisoned the tips of the stakes in order to obviously ensure that maybe you died or were wounded even worse. Sometimes they put actually feces all over them so that would get in your blood and give you an infection, bacterial infection from the feces that were in there. They did all kinds of nasty things with that. They also had tripwires all over. You have to think about the jungle is so thick and there's brush and undergrowth everywhere. It's very difficult to see tripwires, and there'd be tripwires that would set off like a series of landmines or grenades or whatever they might have had out there. They would have been all over the place. Tripwire. So really, like, every step was dangerous. The other thing they had, of course, were landmines all over. Landmines that you stepped on, and what happens, you step on a landmine, it triggers the explosive device, and then when you release your weight, it explodes. And so there were all kinds of these landmines. So tripwires, punji pits, landmines, they were all over the place. There are so many landmines used in Vietnam that there are still people today that their job is to try to go out and find landmines. It's less and less, of course, every year, but there are still a certain number of people every year in Vietnam that die from stepping on landmines that are Vietnam War era. So landmines were used a ton. So you can see why that would be difficult for the United States. I mean, here you could go for weeks or days and never see the enemy, yet people in your group are killed, are wounded. I mean, it was really a frustrating experience for American troops. The next difficulty. Oh wait, I actually have do want to read something about the booby traps here. I had a quote that I wanted to read. Sorry. This one. Shoot, I went to the wrong page. Sorry. Got a few quotes here that I want to make sure I read. Getting ahead of my notes here. All right. The quote here. It said the VC, again meaning the Viet Cong, set off 10 mines which were spread out under the trail on the trail under us. When they all went off at once, every man in the patrol was hit. The corpsman who was behind me was killed instantly. The squad leader right in front of me lost both of his legs from the knees on down. I have never been so scared in my life. So you get a little bit of a sense there maybe of what that was like. All right. Distinguishing friends from enemies. I already talked about that one. So the last one, and I don't know how many you got down, but the last one would be that low troop morale was what made things difficult in Vietnam. And there was low troop morale for a few reasons. Number one, American soldiers are largely drafted, largely don't want to be there. And so they're fighting the American tour of duty in Vietnam was 1 year. So if you went to Vietnam, you went for a year, and so you were fighting basically to survive largely. You weren't taking a lot of extra risks for the most part because your goal was to make it home. You wanted to get through a year and get home. And so that kind of leads to some low morale. But all the things that we talked about lead to low morale. Fighting in the jungle, the belt-to-belt fighting where you can't bring in your, advantages in artillery and air power, all the booby traps where you wouldn't even see the enemy, but people are dying and wounded. Really, one of the big ones was not being able to tell friend from foe. The idea that these people from the South that you were supposed to be fighting for largely didn't want you there, or weren't supporting you, or actively working against you. That certainly led to a lot of disillusionment amongst the soldiers in Vietnam. So a lot of that, low morale certainly is not good in fighting a war if you have, widespread low morale in your troops. I have another quote here for you. This is from a soldier writing to his father here, who'd been in Vietnam. This soldier had previously believed that, he was kind of gung-ho about going to Vietnam. We're going to fight the communists, etc. And then this is a letter after he'd been in Vietnam for about 6 months. He says to his dad, he says, "Vietnam is no game that I can see, Dad. We're fighting, dying for a people who resent our being here. I guess I'm bitter now, Dad. This war is all wrong." And so I think that kind of can sum up the feeling of maybe a lot of Vietnamese American soldiers fighting in Vietnam during the war. So anyways, that was a lot of things. If you need to go back and re-listen to those and get down in your notes, go for it. But I am moving on here. All right, next one. You can see some questions up there. This is just the picture I found. And actually, these are some of the questions I probably would have asked. But this is actually the exact picture I would have shown if we were in class. And you can see here, those are North Vietnamese troops in the foreground and the little boy there in the front. And I think this kind of just shows excuse me, the determination of the Vietnamese. I would ask you, what do you think the boy is going to be when he grows up, and what does he think he's going to be? And I think you grew up in North Vietnam, believing that your duty was to be a soldier, to fight for the freedom of your country, and I think that kind of shows a little bit of the determination. I know some of you are looking at this picture and wondering, what does this boy have his arm blown off? And I don't believe so. The picture I show at school, you can see a little bit. It looks like you can see his arm. He just kind of got it behind his back there. So I don't believe he's lost his arm, but he is, playing soldier in a world in which being a real soldier is, becoming a real soldier is an absolute almost certainty for every young boy in North Vietnam. And so why are they so passionate? They're largely so passionate because they believe they're fighting to rid the country of what they see as invaders. They see the Americans as just another in a long line of invaders coming into their country. So let's take a look here at our next one, Vietnamese determination. So they were the communists, whether they were the VC or the NVA, were willing to take massive, massive casualties, willing to just surrender large amounts of life. Over 500,000 Vietnamese troops died in Vietnam, yet they never had any trouble getting new people. There were always new recruits ready and eager to join. Like I said, they were fighting, while the United States was the soldiers were largely fighting to make it through their 1-year tour of duty. For the North Vietnamese, for the Viet Cong, I mean, this was a fight for freedom. Fights that you didn't just stop after a year. In fact, when you joined Ho Chi Minh, part of what you were told that Ho Chi Minh had told the troops, when you joined the military, you're told, listen, your duty is to fight for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, no matter what it takes. So essentially, if you're fighting for the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, you are not fighting for any certain set time. You're fighting basically until one of three things happen. One, you win the war and independence is achieved. You are wounded so badly that you can't fight anymore, or you are killed. That's it. And you fight a lot differently when you're fighting like that versus fighting just to try to make it through a year. So that kind of going back to those difficulties again, that sort of makes it difficult too, because we're not fighting for the same. So they're willing to make these huge sacrifices in life. The other thing is, to kind of give you another example of them, here's a quote from Ho Chi Minh. So when we joined the war, this is a quote from Ho Chi Minh to us. He said, "You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and I will win." Think about that for a second. He was willing to take 10-1 casualties, and that's essentially about what it turned out to, just in terms of soldiers. We lost, a little over 50,000, and they had about 500,000 deaths. And yeah, in the end, they became independent, and we left. So, they were willing to take these massive, horrendous casualty numbers in order to achieve their ultimate goal, which to them was independence. What about the hardships of the Vietnamese civilians, the plight of these civilians? The civilians really had it tough in Vietnam. Probably maybe the toughest of any group. We bombed the living daylights out of Vietnam, not just North Vietnam either, because there were bombing raids over South Vietnamese villages, and a lot of the fighting happened in the jungles of South Vietnam. And so there was bombing raids there. There was over 80% of the casualties in the Vietnam War were civilian casualties, over 80%, and almost all of those from U.S. bombing. Just to give you an idea of how much we bombed Vietnam, we dropped more bombs on Vietnam. And think about that map from a minute ago. Vietnam is not that big of a country geographically. We dropped more bombs on little Vietnam than all the countries combined dropped in all of World War II. Not just what we dropped. Every country on both sides dropped in World War II. We dropped more bombs on Vietnam. We bombed the living daylights out of Vietnam. It was a massive bombing campaign. The other thing is the types of bomb that were being used. By the time we get into Vietnam, napalm is used to a large extent. And what napalm is napalm is a firebomb. Napalm itself is sort of like has the consistency of jelly, and it's highly flammable. And so when the napalm bomb explodes and this jelly-like substance goes everywhere, it's sticky and it's highly flammable. It goes everywhere and it burns everything. And there's basically almost nothing you can do to put it out. It's got to kind of burn itself out. So it burns down not only jungle, but it burns down villages. It burns people, of course. And it was pretty awful. And there were literally into the millions of civilians that died in napalm bombings. Give me an idea of this. This is a quote from a Vietnamese villager who was gone from his village, and then he came back and his village had been hit by napalm. So I'm going to read the quote here and give you a little sense of what napalm does. It says, "When we got back to the village, it was so awful that we were in a state of shock. The village had been hit by napalm. More than half of it was burned. Hundreds of people were dead, and many others were burned terribly, but still alive. Some children were burned over half of their bodies and were screaming and crying for their mothers. I saw one small child's body in a bunker that was still glowing. The body looked like a blackened pig. I was so scared I couldn't move." So a little bit there about the plight of the Vietnamese civilians. All right, on to the next one. Unpopularity of the war in the United States. So why is it unpopular? We'll start with that. Why does the war become unpopular? It's obviously not the first war we fought. So why is this war seem to be really almost the most unpopular war the United States has probably ever been involved in? Why is that? So there are a few reasons. So I would say three main reasons. Number one is that a lot of Americans, as the Vietnam War progressed, a lot of Americans looked at this and said, they don't see that this is a good war. They don't see this as a good war. They see it as, I shouldn't say a good war as if there is such a thing as a good war, right? But as a just war. I mean, people look back at World War II and they said, this was something worth fighting for and sacrificing for, to get rid of fascism and the oppression of people all over the world, to get rid of the dominance of Japan and, the cruelties of all the things that we, knew about and then even learned about later that were happening under the rule of the Nazis or Imperial Japan, and that this was worth sacrificing lives and all kinds of other things for in order to win this. It was sort of seen as a good war. Vietnam, people didn't see it that way. People said, why are we fighting in this country halfway around the world in what is essentially somebody else's civil war? And what difference does that make to us? How is this important to the United States security? What happens in tiny Vietnam? Why are we involved in their civil war? And they didn't see it as something that was worth making the same sacrifices, whether it was in life or in anything else. And so that was one of the big reasons that it wasn't viewed the same by a lot of Americans anyways. The second reason that it became unpopular was that, it's just as in a lot of wars, as the death count starts to roll higher and higher, then people again start to question. This was supposed to be something quick and easy, and all of a sudden the death toll is rising. It's 10,000, it's 20,000, it's 30,000, and as more and more young Americans lose their lives, people start to begin to wonder whether or not this is worth it. The third reason, but this one might be the biggest reason that it becomes unpopular, is that the Vietnam War is really the first war that is pretty heavily media covered. There are images on the nightly news every day of what's going on in Vietnam. There are images of napalmed villages and newspapers and on TV. There are images of dead American soldiers, dead civilians, you name it. And this has an impact. Seeing this day after day, night after night, it begins to have an impact on how you feel about things. It's impossible for it not to. On top of that, you had major advances in color. There was starting to be color television now, color photography. So not only are you seeing these images, but you're seeing them in color, and so it seems just more realistic. Pictures like you see of the village burning here on the left. Those kinds of images were in newspapers, were on TV, and it lends a reality to war that black and white just can't do. And so really this enhanced media coverage was really one of the major reasons that the Vietnam War becomes kind of unpopular. I remember asking my dad once what some of his recollections were of the war, and I remember him saying, I remember the thing that always sticks in my mind is that, like, on the end of the news, whatever nightly news they watched, he said every night there was at the end of the news there would be there would be a roll call of all the Americans who had been killed in Vietnam the previous day by name, and he said that just stuck with me like every day. It was just this long list of people who'd been killed, and that it's hard for that not to have an impact on you. So those are the main. There are other reasons, but those are three big reasons why the war became unpopular. You see the second picture here of some demonstrators. Anti-war demonstrations become really big during the war. The first anti-war demonstration happened really just after we started fighting in Vietnam. There were 20,000 people in April of 1965, who went to Washington, D.C. to protest against the war. But at that point, it was still there wasn't the sense that there was an overwhelming amount of protesting or anti-war people yet. However, by 1967, by the height of the war, there were somewhere in the United States, and usually multiple places in the United States, there was a protest every single day by 1967. Particularly, one of the big places for these protests were college campuses. The young people were very, very much, of course there are exceptions, but by and large, the young people of the era were anti-war. There were massive protests, college campuses. There was a protest at some college campus every day. There were protests in other places as well. The largest anti-war protest was in 1969. The largest anti-war protest in U.S. history. 500,000 people went to Washington, D.C. to protest the war. You've seen Forrest Gump. This is the scene in Forrest Gump where he gets up there and he's speaking, and the mic goes out, and he sees Jenny out in the reflecting pool, but they're reenacting that, the largest anti-war protest in U.S. history there in 1969. So lots of that. Part of the popularity as well was the draft, and you can see there your next one is resistance to the draft. There was all kinds of draft resistance. There was, and I want to talk a little bit about the draft here, and then I'll give you a little bit of what people did to resist. But originally the draft, you could get a deferment if you were in college, and eventually draft deferments for college students were ended. Because when you think about it, there was a lot of people pretty angry about these draft deferments for college kids because, what was happening here was that people that got to go to college, particularly even more so probably in those days than today, were people who could afford to go to college, that had the money to go to college, that were, maybe well off. And so what was happening is that all the poor kids were getting sent to war. The kids that couldn't afford to go to college were getting drafted and going and having to fight. And so what was happening was you had, this idea that the rich got to get out of war and the poor had to go fight. On top of that, there was a ton of, in the African American community where there was a lot of thought that this was a really racist policy because particularly in the 1960s, a large percentage of African Americans, here we are still even in the civil rights movement, and African Americans were not getting equal opportunities, particularly in the South, but really in the North as well. All over the country, we're not getting opportunities in education, opportunities to succeed financially, etc. So you had large numbers of African Americans who were very poor, and so you had. While there was about somewhere in the neighborhood of about 13% of the nation's population was African American, something like 25% of all draftees were African Americans, which is way over. I mean, theoretically, it should be about 13%, whatever your number of the population is. So what you had was huge numbers of African Americans who were going and then being drafted, and of course this would rub a lot of African Americans the wrong way, as here they were going and fighting a war for somebody else's freedom, and yet they would come home and they wouldn't have their full rights back here at home. And so anyways, that helped lead to some of the resistance as well. So what kind of things did people do to resist here? Back to resistance to the draft. There were lots of people that burned their draft cards. You can see here in my next picture, their draft card burning here. You can see them kind of holding up. It's a little bit blurry of a picture, but they're actually burning their draft cards. We're saying, I'm not going to go. I'm going to refuse to go to the draft. Some men went to jail. That people were arrested for refusing to go, for burning their draft cards, for not registering. It's a crime. I mean, everybody has to do it. All males that are listening to this, when you turn 18, you have to register for the draft. I think you do it online now, but I remember when I turned 18, I got like a postcard in the mail. I had to fill it out a little bit and send it back. I had to register for the draft. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be drafted, but you have to register for the draft. It's the law. And so a lot of young men, though, were burning their draft cards, refusing to do it. About 500,000 young men fled the country, mostly to Canada, to avoid the draft. Some tried to register as conscientious objectors, saying they opposed war, and some were given conscientious objector status. Not all, but some were. So again, there was a lot of protests of the draft. Part of one of the reasons the war was a little bit unpopular for those reasons. I will do one more draft story here before we move on. Is that when they ended draft deferments, and as we get into the 1970s, they decide that they're going to do a draft lottery. They're going to put, essentially what they do is they put everybody's birth date in a hopper, like on ping pong balls, and they're going to draw out birth dates. All right, every day of the year is in there, and basically if your birth date is in the first 100 drawn, then 50 to 100. Drawn is your birthday, then you are likely you're going to go to Vietnam. If you're between like 100 and say 200, 250, maybe not, will you have to go to Vietnam? If you're after 250, you're probably almost certainly not going to have to go to Vietnam. And so imagine this for a second here. They're having these, literally all over the country. So this is when the college kids, the deferments are ending, and now they're going to be eligible for the draft. And there was a teacher in Waterville who retired a few years back, Mr. Geisler, and he was in college when this happened. And I asked him about it once, and he said we had a party, and he said there were parties all over. He was going to University of Michigan. He said there were parties all over, and this was the same all over the country. People were having draft night parties, and he said, here we're having this party, and then it comes on TV. This thing is televised, and they're drawing out the birth dates. And he said, and there we are. And then he said, he said it was the most surreal moment of his life. He's standing there in this house, they're watching TV, and basically all of their lives, their fate is being played out in front of them. If their birth date is drawn in the early dates, they're going to be going to Vietnam. Maybe they'll die. Who knows what will happen with their life? If they're later, they can continue and get their degree, and their life will be uninterrupted. And it's all based on this ping pong ball lottery. And fortunately for Mr. Geisler, he was drawn in the last 100 his birthday was, and he never had to go to Vietnam, but he did know people that were at that party whose birth dates were drawn earlier and did have to go and serve. So just kind of a surreal type of moment here in regards to the draft. So anyhow, okay, so we're going to keep going. The video's not going to stop, but we're going to get a little music break here for you. This is Country Joe and the Fish is that right? Is that what I'm going with? Yeah, Country Joe and the Fish here with at Woodstock with a protest song here. So listen to the words. It's Woodstock, the famous concert, and basically 1969. A lot of young college kids, hippies, and so there'll be some words at the bottom eventually. But anyhow, listen, enjoy. And I'll be back with a little bit more in a minute.
Give me an F. Give me a U. Well, come on, all of you big strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Why, man, this is war a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made. Supplying the army, rules of the trade. Just overpaid if they drop the bomb. We're dropping on the Viet Cong. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, generals, let's move fast. Your big chance is here at last. Now you can go out and get those Reds, cause the only good commie is one that's dead. And you know that peace can only be one when they're blowing them all the kingdom comes. Sing it! 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn.
I'll warn you here, Country Joe's going to get a little salty, so if you're sensitive to bad language, you might want to mute it for a minute.
This is people, I don't know how you expect to ever stop the war. You can't sing any better than that. There's about 300,000 of you fuckers out there. I want you to start singing. Come on. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. Now come on, let loose about the land. Pack the boys on Vietnam. Come on, fathers, don't hesitate. The same songs off before it's too late. We the first one on the rock and come home on the block. All right. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for?
All right. Okay, Country Joe. I hope you enjoyed that famous scene from Woodstock there. Country Joe and the Fish. One of the most famous protest songs. If we would have been having regular class, everybody would have gotten the chance to write their own Vietnam War song. But unfortunately, that one hits the cutting room floor here. So onward here to our next one. Our picture here, that is Lyndon Johnson there, LBJ. Obviously, things are not going very well here for LBJ in this picture. Some despair. I will, if we were doing this in class, I would ask you, do you feel bad for Lyndon Johnson? So think about it for a second. Do you feel bad for LBJ? here. Some people in the past will have said, I do feel bad for him. He didn't necessarily want to get involved in this. He sort of had to be tough on communism. He had great ideas, great society, all these other things, and now he's gotten himself into Vietnam. Others say, no, it was his choice. He didn't have to do this if he believed it was wrong. He was the one who put in combat troops, etc. So anyway, whatever your opinion is, think about it. What do you think? So anyhow, back to the outline here. Fighting a losing battle. So the war reaches its height. The height of the war, without question, was 1968, the year 1968. In 1968, there are 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. We are dropping 1.2 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. By this point, 1.2 million tons of bombs. There are 130,000 Vietnamese civilians dying a month in Vietnam in 1968. Think about that. 130,000 a month are dying in Vietnam. On our side, by the end of 1968, 35,000 Americans had died. And so that toll is going up as well. So certainly the height of the war here. But despite all of this, the government is telling everyone that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. LBJ is saying, listen, I know it doesn't look great, but we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to win this war. Hang in there with us. We're going to get it done. Then comes the Tet Offensive. So first of all, what is Tet? Tet is a Vietnamese holiday. It's like celebrated it's like Vietnamese New Year type of thing. December, January. It's a long deal. And so there is an agreement between all sides, the South Vietnamese and the Americans make a deal with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, the NVA, that, hey, we're going to have the ceasefire during the Tet holidays. People can, not worry about there being bombings and dying, and people can celebrate and whatever. Then we'll resume the war basically when that's over. But what happens is that there is this, despite this supposed ceasefire, the Viet Cong, launched this massive surprise offensive into the cities of South Vietnam. Now, this is a big deal because all the fighting up to this point had basically been out in the jungles and in the rural areas, the villages, not in the major cities like Saigon, the capital. And this is a launch of about 70,000 Viet Cong soldiers into the cities of South Vietnam, where they're gonna attack into these cities. Now, this is a more of a big deal because we are totally caught off guard. Our intelligence totally failed here. We had no idea. We thought the ceasefire was good. We're totally unprepared as they flood into the cities. And there's some. I'm not going to show it. Don't have time. I want to add more to it, but there's some great video. I mean, basically like street fighting in Saigon, outside of the U.S. Embassy, even. I mean, it gets a little bit crazy here. And so anyways, what's the outcome of this? What's the outcome of this massive VC invasion? About 70,000 troops, by the way, invade into the cities of South Vietnam, taking the war to the cities for the first time. So what's the outcome? There are two outcomes. Make sure you write them both down. The first one is the military outcome. So what is the military outcome of the Tet Offensive? The military outcome of the Tet Offensive is a victory for the United States. There, of the 70,000 Viet Cong troops that invade the southern cities, 50,000 are killed, and the other 20,000 have to escape back out and back into the jungles. And it essentially very much limits the VC for the rest of the war. I mean, their force is so diminished after the Tet Offensive that they're not nearly as an effective fighting force again. But the oh, by the way, only about 2,000 Americans die in this. So militarily, it's a major victory. However, the second outcome is the political outcome. And politically, this is just a disaster for the United States. And that's really the more important thing, is that because this shows that there really isn't a light at the end of the tunnel to the American people, that we are not that close to winning, that the war has got a long ways to go. Because if there was a light at the end of the tunnel, I mean, the cities of South Vietnam were thought to be unattackable, impregnable. And yet here they are launching this attack, a successful surprise attack into the cities of South Vietnam. It totally proves that obviously the war is not nearly over. And it's going to be a very difficult battle. And so what you get is a ton of protesting and anger, and the anti-war movement gains even more momentum. President Johnson's approval ratings just sink. This is LBJ here after he's gotten word that the Tet Offensive has happened, that there's been this surprise attack into the cities. That's his reaction. I like this picture because rarely do you get such a candid shot of a president like this. It's in a moment of essential despair as he realizes what this means and what it's going to lead to. And despite, again, our military victory and a total political disaster. So the cost of the war up to this point. So the cost of the war, and this is in not just in terms of money, but I'll start with money. At this point, $6 billion has been spent on the war, and that's in 1960s money. I didn't look up what that would be in today's money, but probably at least 3 times that, maybe more in 2020 money. So $6 billion. Maybe more importantly, this has cost Lyndon Johnson his baby, the Great Society, his war on poverty. You know what you worked on last week, this great goal of his to end poverty in America. There's just no money for any of the programs. Most of the money is going to Vietnam. As Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, the Great Society died on the battlefields of Vietnam, and that's because there was no more money for it. So that happens. The other cost, of course, is in American lives, the mounting death toll, but also the cost is that by the end of this, a majority of Americans begin to think that our involvement in Vietnam is a mistake. And so the cost of all this is that people are starting to turn on LBJ, are starting to turn on the government involvement, our involvement in Vietnam, et cetera. So that's a lot of the cost. The sad part of this for LBJ is, to add on to his misery, is that here all this is happening in 1968, and that 1968 is an election year. So he is up for re-election. He'd served less than 2 years of Kennedy's term. He served his full term himself, and now he could go for re-election again, and had planned all along to try to go for re-election again. So he's got, of course, he's got choices here. The number one issue in the 1968 election, of course, is going to be Vietnam. And so he has basically three options to propose to people. Like, this is what I'm going to do with the war if I'm reelected. He can choose to escalate the war. There are a number of military people who are telling him that we should up the number of troops, that all we need is more troops. We need another 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, whatever the case might be, troops. That's what we need. We need more troops. We'll overwhelm them. We need more troops. Second option, of course, is just to stay the course. Keep doing it like we're doing it. Fight sort of this limited war of defense of South Vietnam. Keep them as independent and keep going and believe that the way we're doing it will end up in victory. The third thing is to start to withdraw, to say, hey, we're going to start withdrawing American troops out in one way or another. What that means for South Vietnam, how we're going to work that. That's part of it, but that's the main idea. Start taking troops out of Vietnam. And there are some that believe that more troops is good. Some believe that it won't matter. The Secretary of Defense tells LBJ that he believes that we can put in 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, 400. It doesn't matter how many more troops we put in Vietnam. This is an unwinnable war. They're going to fight to the bitter end no matter what. No matter what we do there, it's going to be unwinnable. So Johnson's got a really tough decision here. What's he going to propose to the American people? And what he actually does is he chooses a fourth course of action. He chooses to let the next guy decide. He chooses not to run for re-election in 1968. And it'll be up to whoever the next president is. And we'll get to that next president here in just a minute. Uh, 1968. All right, so violence escalates at home and abroad. Back to 1968. We'll start with violence at home first. 1968 definitely saw some violence at home. Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, very, very sadly. Later in the year, running for president, JFK's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, is running for president on the Democratic side. He's actually running on a platform of getting the United States out of the war in Vietnam if he's elected. He's running against Richard Nixon and others. He hasn't gotten the nomination yet, but it does appear he wins the California primary in the early summer, and it does appear that he may be very likely the Democratic nominee for president. After he wins that California primary, he gives a speech, and he's exiting. He's at a hotel, and he's exiting out through the hotel kitchen, kind of out through the back, and Bobby Kennedy sadly meets the same fate as his brother, and he dies to an assassin's bullet. A man by the name of Sirhan shoots him in that hotel kitchen on his way out, on his way leaving, and he dies. And other than Bobby Kennedy, there was unfortunately not a really great, strong Democratic field, and so it paves the way for Richard Nixon to become president of the United States. I guess for better or for worse, Richard Nixon will become the president of the United States. He'll win that. Meanwhile, more violence in Vietnam as well. The My Lai massacre. We can see the picture here. This is sort of a picture from the My Lai massacre. The news of the My Lai massacre reaches the United States in 1969. It actually happened in 1968, but it had been kind of covered up. Basically, what had happened was that a group of American soldiers had gone into the village of My Lai, and it was full of women and children, about 200 women and children, and they had killed all 200 women and children in that village, burned the village, etc. While they were there, was essentially retaliation for, they believed that the villagers had been aiding the Viet Cong, had known that the area around them was booby trapped, etc. And some of the soldiers in this unit had been killed or wounded from the booby traps and VC attacks, and they just kind of lost it. The commander of the platoon sort of lost it, and they went in and they did a horrible thing, and they killed all the people in that. Eventually, the leadership was court-martialed, put on trial for what they had done there. I'm going to read you a quote. This is from another soldier who was testifying at the trial about what he saw. So here's what he said about it. He said, "Just outside the village, there was this big pile of bodies of Vietnamese dead. This really tiny kid, he had only a shirt on, nothing else. He came over to the pile and held the hand of one of the dead. One of the GIs behind me dropped into a kneeling position 30 meters from this kid and killed him with a single shot through the head." As you might guess, that news of this did not make the war any more popular at home. There were already, images and things of dead civilians, and now talks of, massacres of villagers and things doesn't add, of course, to the popularity of the war. Richard Nixon is elected president. Obviously, like as I said, 1968, takes office in 1969. It talks there about his peace with honor policy. The number one thing that Nixon wanted is he realized that the war in Vietnam was not winnable, but he did not want to be the first president to lose a war. He said that outright. I'm not going to be the first president to lose a war. And so he wanted to do whatever he could. So he had this peace with honor policy. His goal was to figure out a peace solution in Vietnam where the United States could essentially leave not having to claim a loss. That was the peace with honor. So what he did was he started this thing called Vietnamization. I would write that down under there, Vietnamization, Vietnamization, Vietnamization. What this plan was that we would slowly withdraw American troops and we would Vietnamize the army the fighting. So for every American soldier that was withdrawn had to be replaced by a trained South Vietnamese soldier. So essentially we were slowly turning the war over to the South Vietnamese. That was the Vietnamization program. Bring out American troops, replace them with South Vietnamese troops so that they could fight for themselves, I guess, at that point. All right, moving on to our next picture here. I'll talk about this one in a minute because it deals with this next one. D and E kind of go together. So meanwhile, this is actually Nixon's policy here sort of has some success. There are a few less protests. It does feel like we're slowly drawing out of the war. By 1970, 71, we're down to 200,000, 150,000 American troops, way down from that height of 500,000. But then all of a sudden, Nixon, who has become increasingly frustrated with the fact that the NVA and the VC have all of these camps and weapons depots in Cambodia, gives authorization to bomb these weapons dumps and send troops in to clean them out, basically. So for the first time, authorization is given to go into Cambodia. And so while really what this was made sense militarily, really, because it was a big disadvantage for us, what it said to the American people, however, was that while he was talking about getting out and drawing out troops, this looked like an escalation. We're now taking the war into Cambodia. So it's now not just in Vietnam, but in Cambodia. And by the way, this does set off this awful civil war in Cambodia and millions killed and everything else. But on our side, what it signals to the United States public, or a large part of the public, is some sort of escalation. It really wasn't an escalation, but it did appear to be that. And so it sets off this whole new round of protests in the United States, including the infamous protest at Kent State, which is this picture right here, comes from that. This is a famous picture. Maybe some of you have seen this picture before. So what happens at Kent State University? So at Kent State, there is a major protest after these bombings in Cambodia, and the students burned down the ROTC building there. The ROTC is Reserve Officers Training Corps, and a lot of colleges have them. They are basically, you can go to college, and at the same time, you can basically get training as an officer, and you join the reserves when you're done. It's part of the deal is they help pay for your college, and then you become an officer in the reserves for so many years after you graduate. And like I said, a lot of colleges have them. They still have them today. So the ROTC building, the students are protesting, and they burn the ROTC building down. And so the governor of Ohio, Kent State's in Ohio, the governor of Ohio, in response to this, sends the Ohio National Guard to Kent State University to restore order, essentially. And so now there becomes this military presence on campus. The students do not stop protesting. In fact, there are even bigger protests, and they are, by most accounts, they are essentially trying to. They're not being very nice to the military people there, who they see as the enemy. Can't believe they brought a military presence to a college campus, and they are yelling pretty nasty stuff at them, obscenities, sometimes maybe trying to provoke them, etc. Eventually, the crowd is getting pretty unruly, and it seems like it might get out of hand. And so the head of the Ohio National Guard gets on like the big, I can't think of the name of it, but the loudspeaker, and he says, all right, this is everybody disperse, go back to your dorms. Classes basically are canceled for the day. Everybody needs to go back to their dorms immediately. And so they do. The crowd disperses. The protesters do disperse. They start going back. And then what happens next is a little bit murky. Or why it happens, I guess, is a little bit murky. What happens isn't that murky. Members of the Ohio National Guard open fire, and 4 students are killed, including the young man you see here laying on the ground. You see the girl there screaming, and this is one of 4 students who are shot and killed by the Ohio National Guard. Why they did that, again, this is there are a lot of different versions of the story depending on who you are and your perspective on things. The National Guard will say that they were threatened, that they felt in danger, and that they were protecting themselves. The protesters will tell you that there was no danger. It is true that none of the 4 students who were killed were within 200 yards. In fact, one of the students who was killed wasn't even involved in the protest. They just happened to be walking across that area from wherever their class had been or wherever they were headed. I'm not sure, but and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So what it did, though, is this led, college campuses all over America just erupted in protest, massive protest, basically, essentially every college in America after this happened. The young people looked at this and said, the government has turned on us. Their government is shooting college students on campus. That, our own government is turning on us now. We can't even protest against the war. The government's turning on us. And so colleges all over the country, in fact, over 400 colleges across the country just shut down. They ended the school year early because they were, afraid that there was going to be violence on their campuses, that there might be burning of buildings, there might be who knows what could happen. And so to prevent that from happening, they just shut down early. So that's the story of what happened at Kent State. I have another song here for you, a little song break, and we're getting close to the end here, but I do want to play this one. The song is called Ohio. It has to do with this. There'll be some images from this, and the song goes along with it. So take a little song break here, and then we'll move on. We'll finish it out. We're getting close to the end here.
finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, for dead in Ohio. Gotta get down to it, soldiers are running us down. Should have been done long ago. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know? Gotta get down to it. Soldiers are coming us down. Should have been done long ago. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know? Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. For dead in Ohio. 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 How many more? For dead in Ohio. For dead in Ohio.
All right, and we're back. All right, let's close it out. A couple more to go, and then we'll call it a day here. So, moving on to our next one, the end of the Vietnam War. So ceasefire. And end of the war in Vietnam. So what happens here? So Nixon comes into office in 1969 with this idea of peace with honor, and he had, as we said, we're slowly drawing out troops, and he's also had been in secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese for years now. And finally, in 1973, they're able to come to an agreement. There are basically four main parts of the agreement. The United States is going to remove all. Number one is the United States is going to remove all combat troops within 60 days. Number two, all prisoners of war on both sides are going to be released. That's number two. And number three, the 17th parallel will continue to divide North and South Vietnam. Essentially, there will still be a North and South Vietnam until some sort of peace can be reached. And number four, all sides will cease activities in Cambodia and Laos. And so this happens finally in 1973. So in 1973, that's what happens. Those are the four things again. And in 1973, combat troops do leave Vietnam. American combat troops do leave Vietnam. Now, there is some people left behind. There are still some military advisors. We do still have a presence at an embassy in South Vietnam. It's not like we're totally gone. Again, the country is still split in two. Now, the reality is here that the big thing that Nixon had to have in that was that idea that the 17th parallel would still continue to divide the two countries. The reality was the government had no illusions that the countries were going to stay separate for very long. We knew that it was just a matter of time until the North overtook the South, even though we left in 1973. But this was Nixon's, essentially his peace with honor, was that he was going to get out and we could still claim officially that we didn't lose, because when we left, there was still a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam, and that it wasn't us that lost, that it was the South Vietnam it was South Vietnamese who lost, and so we can officially claim that. However, yeah, I mean, we clearly knew that this was not going to last. There was no way that this was going to happen. So, you could say a lot of things about Richard Nixon. We're going to talk, later on here about Watergate and some other things with Nixon. But, I heard once Stephen Ambrose, who was a great historian, somebody who I like his books. He said, he had written a biography of Nixon. He said, you can say a lot of things about Nixon. He said, but I think the worst thing you can say about Nixon is that in 1969 he realized that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. And between that point in 1973, when our combat troops left, 23,000 more Americans lost their lives after he knew that we couldn't win the war. And he says that's the worst thing you can say about Richard Nixon. So, again, that's just opinion, but from a respected historian. So anyways, so now we go fast forward 2 years later. And in 2 years, actually a little bit shorter than that, it's 1974, in 1974, the North resumes the invasion of the South. And so it lasted a little less than a year before they resumed their invasion of South Vietnam. At this point, there are no American soldiers. The South is on their own, and they are being gradually overrun, essentially. And by April of 1975, they are right near the embassy towards the end of April, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam. And so there is major panic at this point. And so this is when things get totally crazy, is in these last days of April of 1975. They got to evacuate the embassy, but there are all kinds of South Vietnamese who are basically begging to get out. They don't want to be there. They're afraid of what's going to happen, particularly people who had worked with the Americans. There was lots of South Vietnamese that worked at the U.S. Embassy, of government officials that, of course, had worked with the U.S. Just normal people in Saigon had worked with the U.S. because the U.S. had such a major presence there. And so there are literally thousands of South Vietnamese that are outside of the U.S. Embassy that want to get into the embassy, that want to get somehow to have the U.S. get them out. If you look at this picture here, those are South Vietnamese civilians getting on an American helicopter that is taking as many people as they can, basically off the coast, onto aircraft carriers or other American vessels to try to take them out of there. And we did take out thousands of people in those last few days, but we couldn't take everybody. I mean, people are literally crowded around the fence of the embassy. Women are literally trying to throw their babies over the fence, begging them to at least take their kids so they don't have to be there. They didn't know, again, what was going to happen. Would there be executions? Would they have to go to camps? They didn't know what was going to happen. And people were just in an absolute panic. It was total chaos in Saigon on those last days. We did take a lot of people off. If you look at this next picture here, we took so many people that the ships were becoming overcrowded. They started pushing helicopters into the ocean to create more room on the ships towards the end. I mean, it was like total chaos. Another one of the stories from that is from a reporter. So there's a lot of press still in Vietnam, obviously. And there's this crazy story that I saw once in a documentary. And there's this reporter. He is somebody tells him, he says, "Listen, they can start to hear gunshots, and people can see the North Vietnamese tanks around the outskirts of the city." And he says, "Listen, you got to get out of here. We don't have the time for you to be able to leave. If you don't get out, like the last plane is leaving in like an hour. If you're not on it, there's not going to be any way to get out of here. And I don't know what they're going to do to foreign journalists." So the guy says, okay, he's going to the airport. He gets to the airport, and there's a plane full of journalists. There are some Vietnamese people on the plane too. Friends of theirs are trying to get out again, as many people as they can. And they're on the plane. And he said, he's looking out the window and you can see tanks, there's gunfire, and they're getting ready to take off. And all of a sudden there's this rush of people onto the runway. And there are hundreds of South Vietnamese who are now starting to climb, trying to get on the plane. It's one of these planes and the stairs are going down to the tarmac. And so people are trying to climb up. They're blocking the path of the plane. But you can see the tanks. They're going to try to take over the airport. And finally the pilot, he just got to go. And there's people in front of him. There's people all over. There's hanging on the plane, and they're running these poor people over. And he's taking off. And the reporter says, "I was sitting. The door to the plane is still open as they're taking off." He says, "I looked down, and and we're taking off, and we're starting to get up in the air now, and 100 feet, 200 feet, and there's this guy, he's still hanging on, and he realized he's not gonna be able to hang on anymore, and he said, "I never forget it." He looks up at me and he smiles, and then he just lets go. And it was just crazy in those last days. I mean, people doing anything they could to try to get out. Just total chaos as they're going in those last days. But that's some of the last fighting. On April 30th, 1975, South Vietnam officially surrendered to North Vietnam, thus ending the Vietnam War, which for us was essentially 1965 through 73, then ending there in 75. But for the Vietnamese, really started in 1946, where they're fighting against the French. So April 30th, 1975, the end of the Vietnam War. All right, we finally have made it to the last one: the effects of the Vietnam War. So you see here, this is the Vietnam War Memorial. Before I get to those effects, this is in Washington, D.C., and what the Vietnam War Memorial is, it's a long, you can see part of it here, it's a basically long reflective black wall, and on it, you can sort of see it here, is etched into it are the names of every American killed in Vietnam, and it's in the order of when they died, basically chronologically. So the first name on it is the first soldier to die in Vietnam, to the last one is the last soldier to have died in Vietnam. You can see here, he's got a piece of paper up here. One of the things that people do, particularly family members or guys who fought with them, they'll go and they'll find the names, and you like sort of shade over the paper as of somebody you knew. It's a big thing that people do there. You can also see that it's reflective. That was done on purpose when they designed it, so that you could sort of like see yourself in the reflection as you were looking at the names of the people, whether it was, again, family members or guys that you had fought with. You can see here, this is a soldier, a Vietnam vet there at the wall, having a bit of a tough time, as he is probably looking at some of the names of the men he'd fought with in Vietnam who didn't make it. I would highly recommend, if you make it to Washington, D.C. sometime, to visit the Vietnam War Memorial. It's all part of the National Mall, this area with the monuments and memorials and things, but it's sort of down in this little bit of a low area, and my recollection from being there was just how quiet it was. There's people all over up in the higher ground, but the way they did it is that it's almost quiet, just totally quiet down there. No matter how many people are around in the other areas, you can't hardly hear any of it. It's a pretty moving experience. So anyways, I would highly recommend. I hope everybody at some point gets to Washington, D.C. There's so much history and things to see and do there. But I would highly recommend, spending a few minutes at the Vietnam War Memorial. Anyhow, effects of the Vietnam War. So we'll go through them. I think I have, what do I have? There's seven things. I think I'll have close to that probably. So let's go ahead and go through those. Number one, 58,000 Americans lost their lives in Vietnam. Another 300,000 wounded in Vietnam. So obviously a major physical impact in terms of loss of lives and wounded in Vietnam. Number two, the second effect is the Vietnamese. 4 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians lost their lives. I mean, 4 million. I mean, that's just an incredible number. It was 10% of their entire population died during the American portion. That doesn't even count how many died during their fights with the French. But 4 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians died in Vietnam. The war cost $120 billion. Again, and that's in 1960s and 70s money, $120 billion. And to that point, these kind of go together, but up to that point was the longest war we had ever been involved in. Also, the next thing, number three, would be there were tens of thousands of Americans who came home, soldiers, veterans of Vietnam, who suffered from a wide variety of debilitating things, from depression to the effects of Agent Orange, which was, we dropped, if you remember earlier, I said we had a hard time seeing the Ho Chi Minh Trail because it was so thick. We dropped this stuff called Agent Orange, which is a herbicide, all over the jungle to try to kill the jungle foliage, and also to kill North Vietnamese crops. But so we could see down or easier was really one of the main reasons. The problem was it's highly toxic, and all kinds of Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers inhaled this stuff, and it caused birth defects in babies. It caused men to be sterile. It caused deformity. It caused cancer in all kinds of soldiers. Almost every single year I teach this, and obviously this year will be a little different because we're not in person, but almost every single year when I teach this, somebody raises their hand and says, my grandpa or my uncle or, my great uncle, whoever, somebody that they knew had gotten cancer and died from Agent Orange while they were in Vietnam. So, there's a lot of people that, that had this effect. Number 4, oh, by the way, drug addiction, going back to the last thing that the soldiers dealt with, was also drug addiction. Drugs were rampant in Vietnam. And soldiers who were on leave in cities like Saigon, wanting to forget some of the horrific things that they had seen and been a part of. There was a lot of soldiers that got addicted to drugs. And, you may leave Vietnam, a soldier may leave Vietnam, but the drug addiction comes with it. And it's really difficult for any soldier to reacclimate to regular society, but almost impossible if you are addicted to drugs when you come back as well. So anyhow, that was another one, going back to that last one. So number 4, fourth thing is one of the effects was that the returning soldiers were not treated very well when they came home. There were no parades for the soldiers coming home. In fact, soldiers oftentimes felt like pariahs in their own communities. You didn't even want to be known as a Vietnam vet oftentimes, sadly, because, people would yell at them that they were baby killers. They would, spit on them. People wouldn't want to sit near them. I mean, just some really awful stuff. Not for everybody, but some people had trouble getting jobs. Some people didn't want to hire vets. Things like that. I mean, the way that Vietnamese veterans were treated was really, really awful. One story that always sticks in my mind that I can't remember if I read or saw in a documentary once, but story of a soldier who was coming back from Vietnam, and he had was on a plane. He was flying home. He wasn't wearing his military uniform. He was just wearing civilian clothes. And he got on the plane, and he had just gotten back. He'd served his tour, and he was flying home. And he sat down, and some guy was like on a business trip on the plane, sat next to him, and they were having a friendly conversation. And the guy said, "Oh, well, where are you up to? Where are you coming from?" And he said, "Well, I just got back from Vietnam, and just served my time over there, and I'm actually on my way home now." And the guy sitting, the businessman, signals the flight attendant and comes over, and he says, "I need you to find me a new seat immediately, as far away from this man as possible." For nothing other than the fact that he had been in Vietnam. So I think one of the lessons we should learn from Vietnam is that you can hate the war, and that is absolutely your right as an American. You can protest the war, you can hate the war, you can vote in people who are going to end the war, you can do all of that. That is your right as an American. That's one of the things that we have fought all these wars for. Hate the war, but don't hate the soldiers that fight the war. Soldiers are doing their job, doing their duty. Particularly in Vietnam here. So many of the soldiers were drafted. They didn't even volunteer to be over there in the fight. And so to treat them that way was pretty horrendous. Anyhow, I think I'm on number 5 here. While this is debatable and officially we don't have to claim it this way, most consider Vietnam to be a loss. Our goal there was to contain communism, and obviously that was unsuccessful. We did not contain communism. South Vietnam did fall to communism, and so most people look at this as a loss, even though officially there was a South Vietnam when we left, so we don't have to officially claim it. Most people don't see Vietnam as a win. 58,000 Americans lost their lives, and in the end, South Vietnam became communist anyways. So what about the domino theory? How true did that prove to be? Here, number 6, I think we're on. The domino theory proved to be a little bit true. After South Vietnam fell, eventually Cambodia and Laos both did become communist as well. But it did not spread beyond there, and it certainly did not spread to the rest of the world. And in fact, obviously today there are not that many communist countries left in the world. But the idea of the domino theory was a little bit true. Number 7, I think we're up to. Number 7, South Vietnam still communist today, of course, one of the effects of the war. Speaking of those communist countries, it is one of the last few remaining communist countries in the world. North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, China, beyond that, I can't think of any offhand that are actually still around. But Vietnam's still a communist country. We do actually have a trading relationship with Vietnam today. We allow Vietnamese immigration. You can travel to Vietnam. Those things. That didn't happen immediately, but our relationship with Vietnam in modern day isn't terrible. But they are still a communist country, though they have opened up the economy some in recent years. So a little bit more of a open economy than it used to be. Number 7? So number 8. Number 8 is that yes, we are leery. I don't know if there's only 7 there, making 8th one, but we are a little bit leery today of getting involved in anything that resembles a Vietnam that could end up like Vietnam. It's called Vietnam syndrome, and I think it even still affects us a little bit today. Politicians are a little bit wary of getting involved. No, you could make an argument that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are a little bit similar, sort of seemingly almost unwinnable, that we were involved in for a very, very long time. But again, hard to say. So anyhow, those are some of the effects of the Vietnam War, and I am done. I'm going to play one more song, so don't stop yet. If you've enjoyed the music here, I hope you have. Got one more for you before we're all done. But that'll be it. I've gone for a long stretch here. I don't even know how long this has been going on. If you stuck with me straight through, I'll give you credit. Like I said at the beginning, this is usually a couple of classes. So if there's stuff that you're missing, go ahead back and rewind it. Otherwise, you feel free. I'll be on Google Hangouts Monday and Wednesday at 10:30. So you come in there, ask me questions. You want to know more about Vietnam. Obviously, if we'd have been able to have class, I could have gotten more in depth on things like the tunnels and helicopter use and all kinds of things like that. So if you're interested in some more Vietnam stuff, then I'd love to see you there. But otherwise, I'm going to play this last song and we'll call it good. So I hope it hasn't been too bad for you, and sort of similar to what we would have done in class, the closest thing I could do from here. So here we go. Anyway, thanks for hanging in there, and don't forget to have your notes ready for your quiz on Friday. Here you go.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Paranoia strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. You better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. You better stop. Hey, what's that sound?
All right, hour and 45 minutes. Signing off. Take care.